Elaine Metcalf wasn't the kind of woman people worried about. At 43, she was steady, predictable, and deeply rooted in her routine. She'd been living in the same modest house on Elmwood Drive for nearly 16 years, raising her only son, Adam, after her husband left when Adam was 2. Most evenings, especially in the summer, she went for a walk after dinner. Same street, same time, same gentle wave to neighbors if they were outside. It was almost muscle memory. People remembered the way she'd pass by with her arms tucked behind her back, hair tied up, always in sneakers, never in a rush. That night in June, 2009 was no different, or at least it didn't seem that way. According to Adam, he had fallen asleep on the couch watching a rerun of Law and Order. The spaghetti pot was still warm on the stove. Her keys and purse were on the counter. Nothing looked out of place. When he woke up around 10:30 p.m., the house was dark and still. That's when it hit him. She hadn't come back. At first, he figured maybe she ran into someone and got caught up talking, or maybe stopped at the nearby Walgreens. But her phone was still on the charger, and the back door was unlocked, just the way she'd left it. He waited. Midnight came and went. No sign of her. He didn't call the police until 6 the next morning. The responding officer initially treated it like a misunderstanding. Adults go missing all the time, he said. Maybe she left voluntarily. Maybe she needed space. But Adam insisted she wouldn't do that. She had groceries planned the next morning, a dental appointment the following week. Her calendar on the fridge was filled in, color-coded even. She was the kind of woman who returned library books on time. This wasn't her. Within 24 hours, it became clear that Elaine hadn't just walked off. Larchwood was a quiet town, one of those suburbs just far enough from Chicago to feel insulated from the world's chaos. Crime was rare. People left their doors unlocked. Neighbors had known each other for decades. It didn't make sense. A woman didn't just vanish from a well-lit street without anyone seeing or hearing a thing. But that's exactly what happened. Police brought in tracking dogs, combed the surrounding streets, searched the small wooded patch behind the elementary school, and checked traffic cams from nearby intersections. Nothing. No clothing, no footprints, no signs of struggle. It was as if she'd evaporated into thin air. The neighborhood watch, mostly retirees, organized nightly patrols. Volunteers set up flyers at bus stops, gas stations, and grocery store bulletin boards. News stations began covering the case by day 3. The image of Elaine, smiling, short brown hair tucked behind her ear, plain blue sweatshirt, became a constant on local TV. Investigators focused on timeline. Neighbors recalled seeing her leave the house around 7:20 p.m. She always walked the same loop, east on Elmwood, south past the post office, around the small pond by the senior center, then back up through Rosewood Lane. It usually took about 40 minutes. That night, no one remembered seeing her on the return path. One neighbor, a woman 2 houses down, recalled seeing Elaine pass by her garden, nodding politely. That was around 7:35 p.m. After that, nothing. No confirmed sightings. It was like she vanished mid-step. By the end of the first week, theories began to swirl. Maybe she was abducted. Maybe she fell somewhere and hadn't been found. Maybe she knew someone from the past, who had reason to silence her. But there were no enemies, no stalkers, no shady contacts. Elaine didn't have a boyfriend. She didn't go out much. She wasn't on any dating apps. She worked part-time at a local insurance office and spent most evenings at home. Police spoke to co-workers, friends, neighbors, and got the same answer every time. Elaine was good, quiet, normal. That word kept coming up. Normal. But something about the disappearance wasn't. Not the clean kitchen, not the unlocked door, not the absolute void of clues, and not the eerie silence that began settling over the town like a fog. People stopped going on evening walks. Parents held their children a little tighter. Porch lights stayed on longer than usual. Larchwood wasn't supposed to have stories like this. It didn't know how to handle fear in its streets. Meanwhile, Adam remained at the center of it all. 16, awkward and emotionally numb, he told the media he just wanted his mom to come home. He didn't cry in interviews. He didn't fall apart. Some people thought that was odd. Others thought it was trauma. Either way, the case didn't make progress, and the town didn't have answers. By the end of the month, posters started curling at the edges. Search parties dwindled. The pond was drained. The wooded patch was searched again. Nothing. The official case report ended with a sentence that felt almost cruel in its simplicity. Subject not recovered. Investigation ongoing. But for those who lived there, that night never really ended. And as days turned into years, one fact stayed rooted in the town's collective memory. Elaine Metcalf stepped out into a warm summer night, and somehow that walk never ended. Detectives worked the neighborhood with clipboards in hand, knocking on every door along Elmwood Drive and the surrounding blocks. It was standard procedure. Establish a timeline, collect witness statements, look for the ordinary person who might have seen something extraordinary. But almost everyone said the same thing. They remembered Elaine. They liked her. They saw her sometimes during her walks, gave her polite nods or small waves. But that night, no one heard shouting. No one saw a car screech. No screams, no barking dogs. It was as if time paused for 30 minutes and no one had noticed until it was too late. One neighbor described it as, "Just another Wednesday night," as if that made the disappearance feel more impossible. A few offered coffee to the officers, asking if they'd found anything, trying to help without actually knowing how. Others seemed more cautious, wary of being tied to the investigation in any way. The kind of silence that starts to look less like confusion and more like self-preservation. But then came something different. George Hinley, 76, lived directly across the street from Elaine's home. A widower, soft-spoken retired lineman for ComEd. He said something odd happened that night. Around 7:45, as he was reading by the window, he noticed the porch lights on his side of the street flicker. Not all of them, but just a few, briefly. Enough to make him look up, enough to make him remember. It sounded trivial at first, a power hiccup, a surge, maybe nothing. But the detail stuck with investigators, because it lined up almost precisely with the estimated time Elaine would have passed that section on her return loop. They pulled the utility logs. There had been no reported outage, no maintenance, no issues with the grid. Still, without more, it was just an anecdote, something to scribble in the margins of a report that kept growing thicker with leads that went nowhere. But while the official story stalled, the whispers didn't. People in the town started talking, not publicly, but behind fences and over hushed phone calls. One rumor pointed to a feud between Elaine and her neighbor on the east side, a woman named Carol Jensen. Carol denied any bad blood, but others recalled a tense dispute over a shared fence line the year prior. A landscaping crew had trimmed too far over. Harsh words had been exchanged. But was that enough to suggest harm? Police didn't think so. Another thread hinted at something more personal. A married man, 2 blocks down, had reportedly been spending a lot of time in the Metcalf driveway. He claimed he'd just been helping Elaine with her gutters. Just being neighborly, he told detectives. His wife declined to comment. There was no evidence of an affair, no texts, no calls, just speculation. Still, in the absence of hard facts, even the softest suspicions found traction. Then there was the new guy, Todd Brenner. Moved in less than 2 months before Elaine disappeared. Lived alone, drove a white pickup. Not much was known about him. No one remembered welcoming him to the neighborhood, and he didn't seem to mind. He kept his blinds closed, worked nights, rarely spoke. Elaine's coworker mentioned that she had complained about a man watching her walk near the post office. She hadn't named anyone, just said it felt off. It wasn't a report. It wasn't even written down. It was a passing comment during lunch break, and no one thought much of it until after she vanished. Police visited Todd's house twice. He allowed them in both times. No signs of struggle, no red flags. He had an alibi. He'd been clocked into his shift at a freight warehouse 5 miles away. Surveillance footage backed it up. Still, neighbors didn't like him. His presence became part of the town's growing discomfort, the kind of man who could live among people without ever becoming part of them. By week 3, detectives had built a map of the neighborhood with pins, notes, and routes marked in red. Elaine's last known position was still the sighting outside Carol Jensen's house. After that, it was all inference. There were no helpful doorbell cameras back then, no smart watches, no automatic GPS tracking. All they had was human memory. And human memory, they were learning, was either absent or unwilling. Adam, still processing the loss, began noticing the shift. People stopped talking to him directly. Friends at school kept their distance. Teachers were kind but nervous. He wasn't just a kid without a mother anymore. He was the center of a story everyone was afraid to be in. His house felt heavier with each passing day, not just with grief, but with the pressure of unresolved silence. The neighborhood felt colder too, more suspicious. Doors closed faster. Conversations ended sooner. That early warmth and sympathy the town had extended began to curdle into discomfort. People didn't want to say the wrong thing. Or worse, say something true. And yet, through all the theories and background checks, no charges were filed. No person of interest was named. Elaine Metcalf remained missing, and the place where she'd lived all her adult life became the least helpful witness. Whatever had happened that night didn't leave behind a scream or a tire mark or a single dropped item. All it left was a hole, and a growing certainty that someone, maybe more than one person, knew something they weren't saying. The earliest interviews painted Adam Metcalf as a quiet, well-adjusted teenager just trying to survive the unimaginable. 16 years old, honor roll student, no history of behavioral issues. He told police that he and his mother had a good relationship. Close, predictable, peaceful. He said she'd made spaghetti that night, her usual recipe. They'd eaten in the living room, half watching a show, barely talking. She kissed him on the head before heading out for her walk. Then he fell asleep. The next thing he remembered was waking up alone. The television was still humming. The house was still. And Elaine was gone. But the deeper detectives dug, the less certain that story became. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle in the house, no chaos. Yet something didn't sit right. Why hadn't Adam heard anything? The back door was unlocked. No creaking floorboards, no distant voices, no sounds of a gate opening. When asked, Adam claimed he was a deep sleeper, but his childhood medical records mentioned occasional insomnia. One officer described his demeanor during the early interviews as strangely composed, not robotic, but controlled, as if the emotions were rehearsed. Grief is unpredictable, but the calmness felt off. Then came the issue with the phone records. Investigators obtained a subpoena for the landline and Adam's personal cell. According to the logs, 5 messages had been deleted from Adam's voicemail between 7:40 p.m. and 8:10 p.m. the night Elaine disappeared. When asked, Adam denied deleting anything. He didn't remember seeing missed calls. He said he barely looked at his phone that night. But the timestamps raised more questions than answers. Elaine would have been on her walk during that time, and if someone else had used her phone or had something to say to Adam, those messages were now gone forever. The data retrieval process turned up nothing. Whatever was said, if anything at all, had been lost in that gap of 30 minutes. A polygraph was conducted 2 weeks into the investigation, standard for high-profile missing person cases. The results were inconclusive. Some questions passed cleanly. Others caused noticeable spikes, especially when asked if he had seen Elaine leave the house or if he knew where she might be now. The results weren't enough to label him a suspect, but they weren't enough to clear him either. He wasn't charged. He wasn't even officially accused. But unofficially, the eyes started turning. At school, friends noticed a shift in Adam's behavior. According to classmates interviewed later, Adam had started withdrawing months before Elaine vanished. He became jumpy, always glancing over his shoulder, avoiding eye contact. He started walking home instead of taking the bus. He stopped inviting people over. One friend said Adam once told him he felt like someone was watching the house at night. When asked who, Adam just shrugged, said maybe it was nothing. But the discomfort had lingered. Teachers noted declining grades. One counselor described him as shutting down emotionally, long before the walk that ended everything. Detectives were granted access to Adam's personal belongings, including notebooks, school essays, and a private journal found inside a locked drawer in his bedroom. Most of it was typical, half-finished poems, random song lyrics, small lists. But one page stood out. Written over and over again in pencil, like a line being practiced for a speech, was a sentence that chilled the investigators. She keeps secrets too. It was never explained, never expanded on. When confronted with it, Adam said he didn't remember writing it. He looked at the page for a long time, then quietly asked to go home. That line became a kind of silent obsession for the lead investigator. It didn't accuse Elaine of anything directly. It didn't explain the disappearance, but it changed something in the narrative. Up until that point, Elaine had been the stable one, the safe parent, the quiet neighbor, the woman who disappeared into thin air. But she keeps secrets too implied something more, something hidden. Inside the walls of that house, maybe not criminal, maybe not sinister, but hidden nonetheless. The department consulted with a behavioral analyst, someone brought in to help construct a psychological profile of both Elaine and Adam. The analyst noted that teens under stress often lash out passively, through code, through art, through omission. He also noted that the phrase Adam wrote, while cryptic, could reflect a teenager's emerging realization that parents are fallible, layered, and not always who they appear to be. But when layered with a disappearance, it took on weight, especially since Elaine had no documented mental health concerns, no known history of keeping things from her son. There were moments when Adam looked like a grieving boy caught in something too large to process, and there were other moments when he seemed like he was waiting for everyone to stop asking questions. He remained in the town for 2 more years after the disappearance, staying with his aunt until he turned 18. Then, he left quietly, changed his number, stopped responding to follow-ups. He wasn't running, not exactly, but he wasn't staying either. Still, the memory of those interviews lingered, because Adam never once asked, "Do you think she's dead?" He never asked about remains, about closure, about justice. What he asked every single time was simpler, more disturbing in its consistency. Did she tell anyone anything before she left? 11 days after Elaine Metcalf vanished, a man named Victor Leary was walking his Labrador along a narrow service path that ran behind the old industrial park in Crestford, a town about 20 miles south of Larchwood. The area had long since been abandoned, rusted fencing, warehouses covered in graffiti, weeds pushing through cracked pavement. There was no reason for anyone to be there. But Victor's dog pulled hard toward a patch of blackened ground tucked between 2 overgrown loading bays. That's where he found it. A shattered cell phone case, partially melted, surrounded by a scorched ring of dead grass. He called it in. Investigators arrived within the hour, cordoned off the area, and began a slow sweep. The phone itself was gone, but the case was still identifiable, and inside the scorched plastic frame, they recovered a bent SIM card. It took 2 more days for the lab to confirm what they already suspected. It belonged to Elaine Metcalf. Her phone had left her house with her the night she disappeared. Up until that moment, it had been presumed missing alongside her. But now there was proof it had traveled far beyond her neighborhood, and something had destroyed it violently. The lead detective on the case requested GPS data from the provider. What they got back was chilling, but fragmented. The last clean signal came at 7:36 p.m., just after Elaine was seen walking past Carol Jensen's yard in Larchwood. Then, silence. Hours later, specifically at 11:09 p.m., a single ping hit a cellular tower near the industrial park. It didn't last long, just long enough to be recorded. Investigators theorized the phone had been turned off or out of service range for nearly 4 hours, then briefly powered on before disappearing again for good. There were no calls made, no texts, just that one lonely signal, like a flare going up and dying before anyone could reach it. The industrial park was searched extensively. Drones, cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, no body, no clothing, no personal items, just the burned patch, and the phone case. A fire marshal was brought in to evaluate the scorch mark. He noted that there was no evidence of a large blaze, no accelerants, no residue from gasoline or oil. The burn pattern suggested an intense but isolated heat source, short-lived and oddly contained, possibly electrical, possibly chemical, but it didn't spread. It started and ended in one small radius. The grass outside the circle was untouched. A few days later, an investigator reviewing area surveillance footage caught something on a grainy recording from a gas station half a mile away. Around 11:12 p.m., just minutes after the phone pinged the nearby tower, the security camera picked up a flicker of orange light in the far distance, visible for about 8 seconds over the tree line. The resolution wasn't clear enough to determine the source, but it pulsed, then vanished. Staff at the gas station didn't recall seeing or hearing anything. They were inside. No one reported a fire, no alarms, no smoke the next morning. The footage was played repeatedly. Brightness increased, contrast adjusted. It wasn't headlights, it wasn't lightning, it wasn't a flashlight. It had movement, but not direction. It rose, pulsed, and disappeared. The investigators didn't say the word fire out loud, but they didn't need to. Everyone watching the footage thought the same thing. Something was destroyed out there. And someone made sure it didn't last long enough to be found. Theories multiplied. Some believed Elaine had been abducted and held somewhere between Larchwood and Crestford, that the phone had been with her or with someone who had her, that maybe she tried to escape and managed to turn the phone back on just long enough to get a signal out. Others believed the phone had been disposed of independently, that someone dumped it there to throw investigators off. But the burn complicates that. Why burn a phone you're trying to use as a decoy? Why burn it so cleanly, so completely, in such a remote area? Back in Larchwood, the news reignited public fear. Flyers were reprinted. Tips came in from people who claimed to have seen white vans, strange men, figures in the woods. None of it led anywhere. The police set up checkpoints on roads near the park for 2 weeks. Nothing unusual. No arrests. No confirmed sightings. Elaine's case remained officially classified as a missing person with suspicious circumstances. But, behind closed doors, detectives began to whisper the word homicide. What disturbed them most wasn't the phone itself. It was the effort someone had taken to erase it. If it had simply been thrown in a ditch, that would have made sense. If it had been broken or buried, that too. But the precision of the burn, the fact that it had been fried and discarded in a location so far from home, suggested intent. Not panic, not impulse, planning. The forensic lab tested the casing and SIM card for DNA or prints. Nothing. Whatever heat had touched that phone had destroyed every trace, and without the rest of the device, they couldn't trace its last active apps, its Bluetooth history, or its potential connections to other nearby devices. It was, in every way, a dead end. Except for the fact that it confirmed one horrifying truth. Wherever Elaine had gone that night, she hadn't stayed in Larchwood. Something or someone had taken her out of town. And someone had wanted her voice, her signal, and her evidence to vanish into silence. By the summer of 2011, the Metcalf case had all but faded from the headlines. 2 years had passed without a viable lead. The flyers had been taken down. Candlelight vigils no longer drew crowds. New families had moved into the neighborhood. Life went on, as it always does in places where unsolved things settle into the soil, like bad roots. The case file sat thick and stagnant in a basement archive of the Larchwood Police Department, rarely touched except when a new detective rotated through and decided, for a week or two, to take another look. Most in town didn't speak of it anymore. Those who did used past tense. Elaine had become a story, not a person, until a man named Craig Delano walked into the precinct with his dog. He wasn't local. He lived a few towns over, came into Larchwood often for the farmer's market, and to visit the community garden where his sister worked. He said his German shepherd, Hazel, had developed a strange habit over the past few months. Every time they walked past the narrow trail behind the garden, Hazel would freeze, sniff the air, and pace in tight circles near the edge of the woods, not once, not twice, but every single time. It unnerved him. One day he followed her further in, just to prove to himself there was nothing there. That's when he saw the patch of disturbed earth, something subtle, maybe animal dug, maybe not. He didn't touch it, he just stared at it, then walked out and drove straight to the police station. At first, the report was treated like another dead-end tip, but the detail about the community garden caught a detective's attention. Elaine had volunteered there almost every Saturday, pulled weeds, helped with compost, painted signs for the kids' beds. It was less than a mile from her house. It had never come up as a search site back in 2009 because it fell just outside the defined radius of the original canvassing zone. Still, dogs had been used, and nothing had turned up. But now, this man's dog was reacting like there was something to find, enough to justify a quiet return. 2 days later, officers marked the location and began a slow dig under the supervision of a forensic archaeologist. They found no human remains, no bones, no clothing. But about 6 inches beneath the surface, inside a tangled mass of roots and dry clay, was something small. A bracelet, twisted, partially melted and coated in soil. It was plastic and elastic, with small metallic letter beads, some missing, but enough intact to spell out ELA. In her last known photo, taken by a co-worker days before her disappearance, Elaine wore that bracelet on her left wrist. Investigators compared bead size and layout to the photo and confirmed a match. It wasn't just similar, it was hers. The soil around the item was sent for lab testing, no traces of blood, no signs of decomposition, just residual signs of heat exposure, something intense but localized, enough to warp plastic, not enough to char surrounding plant life. The burn pattern mirrored what had been found near the industrial park 2 years prior. Isolated, intense, deliberate. It suggested something had been destroyed there, or hidden, or marked. The media picked up the story again. Garden Ghost, they called it. The name came from a rumor that a volunteer had once seen a figure standing alone behind the greenhouse at dusk, barefoot, unmoving, watching. No one ever confirmed it, but the nickname stuck. For Adam, now 18 and living 3 states away with extended family, the phrase cut deep. He gave a short statement through his aunt's attorney, asking people to stop turning his mother into folklore. But the story had already grown teeth again. People needed something to say, and without new answers, they settled for shadows. Detectives hoped the bracelet might trigger new leads. Maybe someone buried it. Maybe it had fallen off during a struggle. Maybe someone had returned to the scene later. But no fingerprints, no DNA, no new eyewitnesses. The community garden had gone through 3 volunteer coordinators since 2009. Records were incomplete. Security footage from that era didn't exist. No one could recall anything specific about the area behind the garden. No strange people, no odd smells, just overgrowth, compost bins, and kids pulling carrots. Still, for a brief moment, the discovery reignited a sense of urgency. Officers re-interviewed former volunteers, searched property lines adjacent to the woods, dug 2 more holes based on cadaver dog alerts, found nothing. Elaine's name returned to nightly news in small bursts, but within a month, interest waned again. The bracelet had answered nothing. And without a body, no charges could be filed. It was evidence of presence, of pain, but not of resolution. One detective wrote in a report that the placement of the item felt ceremonial. Not dropped, not thrown, planted, like someone had returned years later and chosen that exact spot. It suggested guilt or grief, or both. But they couldn't prove it. They couldn't even explain it. So the bracelet went into an evidence bag. The forest path was left unmarked, and the man with the dog stopped walking that route. Hazel never pulled toward the trees again. In early spring of 2016, the Metcalf house on Elmwood Drive was finally put up for sale. Adam hadn't lived there in years. The lawn was overgrown, the paint had faded, and the basement had started to leak during heavy rains. A local contractor was hired by the new owners to strip out the aging drywall and re-insulate the lower level. It was routine work, until a worker tapped on a section of paneling near the back furnace closet and noticed the hollow didn't match the rest. The panel popped loose with barely any effort. Behind it was a narrow cavity, barely wide enough to fit an arm through. Stuffed inside, wrapped in a decaying grocery bag, were 17 folded sheets of paper, lined notebook paper, all of them addressed in cursive to A. The letters were turned over to police immediately. Each was written in blue ink. The dates ranged from February to June of 2009, just months before Elaine vanished. They weren't formal. They read like private thoughts, the kind of words someone writes but never sends. Some were only a paragraph long. Others filled 2 pages. But the contents weren't ordinary. They weren't sweet reflections or motherly reassurances. They were warnings, quiet, fearful ones. Repeatedly, Elaine mentioned a man she kept seeing during her evening walks, a man she didn't recognize. She never described his face in detail, just that he never smiled, that he always stood still, that he didn't walk, just waited. One letter, dated March 17th, described seeing him near the post office 2 nights in a row. "He's not following me," she wrote, "but he's always ahead of me somehow. Like he knows my route." Another letter talked about a vehicle, an old pickup parked a block over with its engine running. She said it happened 3 times in 1 week, and each time when she turned back to look, the truck was gone. But the most disturbing letter was the last one. It wasn't dated. It stopped mid-sentence. "If I don't come back one night," the ink trailed off, no signature, no fold. It looked like it had been written in a rush or interrupted. The letters were authenticated by a handwriting expert. No doubt, they were Elaine's. The pen pressure, the phrasing, even the occasional spelling errors matched known samples. But the real question wasn't whether she wrote them. It was why she had never mailed them. Adam never received a single one. He hadn't known they existed. And even stranger, why were they hidden behind a wall? Why not in a drawer, a box, a closet? Why did she write private letters to her son, address them to him, and then seal them inside the house? Detectives tried to reconstruct the timeline. The letters indicated escalating fear, but there were no police reports on file. Elaine never told anyone officially that she felt followed or watched. Not her sister, not her co-workers, not Adam. If she had, it wasn't documented. Some investigators believed the letters were a form of emotional preparation, writing without speaking, bracing for something unexplainable. Others believed they were a last-ditch attempt at control. If something happened to her, maybe the letters would be found. Maybe they were never meant for Adam. Maybe they were meant for whoever found the truth. Neighbors were re-interviewed, but nothing new surfaced. The description of the man, if he ever existed, was too vague. Never smiled, only waited. It was haunting, but not actionable. The mention of the truck was checked against vehicle registrations in the area from 2009, but no connection was found. Surveillance from that time had long been erased, and no one had ever reported a strange man loitering. The letters, for all their emotion and fear, pointed at no one in particular. Adam returned to the house briefly to retrieve some belongings before it was sold. He asked to see the letters. He read them in private, then sat in the basement for over an hour in silence. When asked what he thought, he said very little. Just that he had never seen his mother afraid before. He said she was careful, but not paranoid, and that if she had felt this way and didn't tell him, something must have stopped her, or someone. He requested copies of the letters, but the originals remained sealed in evidence. The find made local news, but not national. The story had gone cold too long ago. For many in town, it was just another eerie footnote, a mother who vanished, and the whispers she left sealed in a wall. But for detectives still assigned to the case, the discovery changed the narrative. It added intent. Elaine knew something was wrong. She feared someone specific. She documented it, and she made the effort to preserve it. But without a name, without a face, and without further physical evidence, the investigation stalled again. The letters hinted at a presence, someone who hovered at the edges of her life, never crossing the line fully, but always close. Whoever he was, if he was real, he knew her routine. He knew her walk, and if she saw him too many times, she may have become inconvenient. The last line, cut off and buried in drywall, said everything and nothing all at once. It left investigators with only one conclusion. Elaine may have sensed her disappearance before it ever happened, but she couldn't stop it, and she couldn't name who would. In the spring of 2024, the quiet stretch of Elmwood Drive, long forgotten by the national spotlight, stirred again. A couple in their early 30s had purchased the white colonial 3 doors down from where Elaine Metcalf once lived. They were new to town, unaware of the street's history, and eager to build a life. Part of that plan included a backyard renovation, a modest in-ground pool and patio. The contractor broke ground on April 17th, just after 8 a.m. Less than 2 feet into the dig, the excavator struck something that didn't belong. At first, they thought it was old piping or utility casing, but what came up in the dirt wasn't municipal. It was metallic, rusted, and sealed at both ends, a drum, roughly 30 gallons, half buried, caked in layers of earth and root. The crew paused work and notified the homeowners. By early afternoon, local police were on site. The drum was carefully extracted and transported to a forensic lab. It was heavy. Inside, they found charred fragments of fabric, warped pieces of plastic, clumps of what looked like human hair, and a thin layer of fine white powder settled at the base. Preliminary analysis suggested the remains had been subjected to intense heat, possibly fire, possibly chemical. But the container itself showed no external burn damage. It had been sealed airtight. Whatever had happened, it happened before burial. DNA testing took 3 weeks. The sample was degraded, but enough mitochondrial material remained. On May 12th, the results came back. The remains inside the drum belonged to Elaine Metcalf, 16 years missing, 16 years of no body, no closure, no physical proof of death. And now she had been found, less than 100 yards from her front door, buried quietly in a neighbor's backyard, in a sealed drum no one ever noticed or claimed to. The news spread fast. National outlets picked the story back up. Reporters lined the street. Commentators speculated. The drum became a symbol of failure, of concealment, of how close the truth had always been. But the discovery, as definitive as it seemed, raised more questions than it answered. No fingerprints were recovered from the drum's surface. The lid had been welded shut, the seam chemically bonded. The tools used to seal it left no distinctive markings. It was industrial work, but not professional. There were no identifying numbers or labels. The origin of the drum was untraceable. The homeowners who had purchased the property in late 2023 were cleared almost immediately. They'd had no idea. But the house had passed through 3 owners since 2009. Each had stayed no more than 5 years. No one had ever dug up the yard. Records showed no permits for landscaping, no soil surveys, nothing to suggest anyone had reason to look. But someone had buried it there. Someone had chosen that spot. And whoever it was had managed to do so without being seen, heard, or remembered. Investigators turned their attention to the occupants of the house in 2009. The Harveys, a retired couple who'd lived there from 2004 to 2010. They were now in assisted living, out of state, both in declining health. Interviews with family members yielded nothing. The Harveys were described as private, but kind. Nothing in their background hinted at criminal behavior. Their children were shocked by the discovery and insisted their parents would never have allowed something like that to happen on their property. But they hadn't lived there. They hadn't watched the backyard day and night, and the Harveys, now elderly and confused, couldn't offer much clarity. They remembered Elaine vaguely. They remembered when she went missing. But no, they said, they'd never seen anyone digging. The backyard had no exterior cameras. The homes on that end of the block didn't either, and in 2009, smart home systems weren't common. The burial could have happened days or weeks after Elaine disappeared. It could have happened the same night. The soil layers weren't distinct enough to determine timing. No one recalled hearing a shovel or seeing fresh dirt. It was a yard like any other, mowed, trimmed, quiet. The forensic analysis of the drum's contents offered a bleak portrait. The fabric scraps included what looked like pieces of a blue sweatshirt, elastic waistband, and what might have been a sock. The melted plastic was consistent with polyethylene, possibly part of a phone or compact. The hair was confirmed to be Elaine's. And the fine calcium particles at the bottom, remnants of bone degraded beyond full reconstruction. There would be no autopsy, no exact cause of death, just confirmation that she had been placed in the drum post-mortem and that intense heat had been applied before sealing. The discovery reopened the case as a homicide, but with no fingerprints, no tool trace, and no timeline. Detectives were left with a chilling realization. The person who had buried Elaine had done it well, carefully, silently, and had lived within the echo of that secret for nearly 2 decades, possibly watching the searches, possibly waving to neighbors, possibly knowing that no one would ever look 3 doors down. The neighbors gathered in stunned disbelief. Some brought flowers, others brought apologies. But the Metcalf home remained empty, its windows shuttered, its lawn left to grow wild again. Adam declined to return to town. He released no statement, but sources close to him said he already knew the truth long before the phone call. What he didn't know, what no one knew, was who had waited for Elaine. And why, all these years later, that answer still refused to rise from the dirt. When news broke that Elaine Metcalf's remains had been discovered just 3 doors down from her old home, detectives reopened their notebooks and began the painful process of circling back. Neighbors were re-interviewed, not just for fresh insight, but for anything they might have ignored, misremembered, or deliberately buried over time. Some had moved away. Some no longer answered calls. Others, now in their 70s or 80s, claimed to remember nothing useful. But then came an unexpected call from an adult son of one of the original residents, someone whose name had been in the original canvas logs but had been dismissed early on due to declining mental health. Her name was Iris Givens. In 2009, she lived alone in the house adjacent to the backyard where Elaine's body had been found. She had advanced dementia now, but her son had recently taken over care and began going through her journals. What he found disturbed him. He described a single entry written 2 days after Elaine disappeared. It mentioned seeing a woman in the backyard at dusk, barefoot, and just standing there, staring at the house like it was making her sad. At the time, he said, he had brushed it off. His mother had already started slipping into confusion, and she often described things that weren't there. Children in the garden, lights in the trees, her late husband reading in the kitchen. But now, after the body was found, the description didn't seem so easily dismissed. He asked her about it again. What Iris said this time was more detailed than anyone expected. She remembered a woman standing still near the center of the backyard, not pacing, not walking, just standing, facing the house, looking toward the second-floor window. When asked how she knew it was a woman, Iris answered simply. She was barefoot, with long hair pulled back, and her arms were crossed tight over her chest. She didn't speak. She didn't move. But Iris remembered something else. She said the woman's clothes were dirty, not stained like from gardening, dirty, as though she'd been outside for a long time. Her feet were muddy, her face was pale, and the look on her face, according to Iris, was like she recognized the house but didn't think it recognized her back. In 2009, this story never made it into the formal record. Her son admitted he hadn't mentioned it during the original canvas because he didn't want her made into a public spectacle. She was already becoming fragile, and he didn't want to deal with media attention or the shame he feared would follow. He had told her to stop talking about it, and eventually she had. But now, with forensic confirmation that Elaine had been buried in that same yard, the old memory returned like a splinter rising through skin. Detectives took the statement seriously, but cautiously. They revisited time logs, trying to determine if Elaine could have survived for some period after her disappearance. The autopsy couldn't provide a time of death, and the degraded remains didn't offer any direct answers. But the sighting suggested a chilling possibility, that Elaine hadn't been killed immediately, that perhaps she had been kept somewhere, that maybe she had escaped or had been brought close to home before something stopped her again. The idea that she had stood in the backyard, feet from safety, visible to someone who didn't understand what they were seeing, haunted everyone involved. The location of the sighting also raised questions. The woman was seen facing the house, not the street, facing the windows. If it was Elaine, why didn't she approach the door? Why didn't she call out? Why didn't she try to escape? Unless she couldn't. Unless she wasn't meant to be seen at all. Some investigators theorized she may have been disoriented, drugged, or emotionally unstable by that point. Others questioned whether the sighting was real at all. But the specificity, the barefoot detail, the dirt, the direction of her gaze, felt too grounded to be coincidence. Iris Givens didn't mention voices. She didn't mention ghosts. She didn't embellish. She just said the woman looked like she'd been waiting a long time and didn't know if she was still allowed to go home. A new theory emerged. Perhaps Elaine had escaped her captor or had been let out temporarily. Maybe she had wandered the neighborhood confused, physically injured, or mentally shattered. Maybe she had made it back to the only place that felt familiar. But she didn't knock. She didn't call out. She just stood in a stranger's yard, staring at the life that had once been hers. And then, at some point, she vanished again. Hours later. Days, no one knows. And whoever had orchestrated it all must have realized the mistake and fixed it before anyone else noticed. The investigators couldn't prove it. There was no footage. No one else recalled seeing her. But the idea stuck. It became one of those moments in the case that didn't make it into the final reports, but never left the minds of the people who carried them. If Iris Givens had seen Elaine, even once, even for a moment, it meant everything. It meant she hadn't been gone that first night. It meant the town had failed her twice, once when she disappeared and once when she came back, and no one reached her in time. In September 2024, Adam Metcalf stepped back into Larchwood for the first time in 13 years. He didn't speak to the press. He didn't go near his old house. He came in through the service entrance of the police station, walked down a hallway lined with faces he didn't recognize, and sat quietly in an interview room for nearly 10 minutes before speaking. Detectives described him as controlled, not cold, but composed in a way that made it hard to read whether he was detached or barely holding it together. He wasn't the awkward teenager they'd once questioned over and over. He was a man now, lean, tired, eyes sunken from years of knowing too much and never being able to say any of it aloud. The questions started small. How had he been? Where had he gone after 2011? Why now? He answered plainly. He'd moved away to live with his aunt in Idaho, then to Denver, then to the edge of somewhere else. No marriage, no children, no trouble. Just quiet jobs and a low-profile life. He said he never wanted to be the center of attention again, but the discovery of his mother's body had changed something. He'd thought he was prepared for it. He wasn't. He said he needed to finish what was left. Then he told them about the envelope. He said it was a Saturday morning, a week before she disappeared. Elaine had made pancakes, something she rarely did during the school year, and told him to come to the kitchen table. She handed him a manila envelope, unsealed but clearly intentional. On the front, in her handwriting, was a single instruction: "Only if I'm gone for good." She didn't explain it. She didn't make him promise. She just slid it across the table, patted his hand, and said, "Don't lose it." And he didn't. He packed it when they moved. He kept it in a locked drawer. He never opened it, not when the flyers curled on telephone poles, not when the search parties stopped, not when the letters were found. He waited, because some part of him still thought maybe she'd come back, until the drum, until the DNA, until there was nothing left to wait for. He opened the envelope 2 nights before the interview. Inside was a single photograph, a low-resolution surveillance printout, grainy and faint, the kind you'd get from an old gas station or discount store camera. The timestamp in the corner was 3 days before Elaine vanished. It showed a woman, Elaine, standing in what appeared to be a parking lot, looking directly into the lens. Her face was calm but fixed, like she wanted it on record that she was there. Just behind her, maybe 8 feet back, stood a man in a dark hoodie. His face wasn't visible. His posture was rigid. His hands were in his pockets, his head slightly tilted toward her. On the back of the photo, written in ink that had faded to a ghostly gray, were 7 words. "If they find me, show this." Adam handed the photo to the detective across the table. He didn't cry. He didn't explain why he'd waited this long. He just said, "Now it's yours." The image was scanned, enhanced, and cross-checked against all known footage from the area. The timestamp matched a gas station on Route 74. It was never reviewed in the original investigation because it was 20 minutes outside the search radius. The station had long since been remodeled, the camera replaced, the footage deleted years ago. There was no way to verify what happened before or after that frame, only that it existed, only that Elaine had gone there, made herself visible, and left behind a warning that no one would hear until it was too late. Facial recognition software failed to identify the man. His features were obscured. The angle, the grain, the lighting, everything worked against the algorithms. But when the photo was shown to former Larchwood residents, a few people said the hoodie looked familiar. It had a logo, partially cut off, partially blurred, but possibly from a now-defunct hardware supply store just outside Crestford. That store had closed in 2010. Its employee records had been destroyed in a flood. There was no way to trace uniforms, no names tied to the design. Another, Wall. Adam said he hadn't recognized the man. He said his mother had never mentioned anyone directly. But she had said she was being watched. He just hadn't known how literal she'd been. He said if she gave him the photo, it meant she'd seen it coming, that she had tried, in her own quiet way, to leave behind a breadcrumb. One image, one moment, one frozen second of eye contact that might outlast her body, her voice, her absence. The photo was filed into evidence. Analysts reviewed the dimensions of the man's height compared to Elaine. They estimated him to be between 5 feet 11 inches and 6 feet 2 inches. Right-handed, based on shoulder tilt, likely between 30 and 45 at the time. But without a face, it was just data. No motive, no name, just a presence, half frozen in pixels, that may have followed her home. Adam left the station after the interview. He didn't return for follow-ups. He didn't attend any press briefings, but he left a note with the detectives before he disappeared again. It was handwritten, short, and taped to the back of a copy of the photo. It read, "She knew, and someone else did too." The image Elaine left behind was studied for days. Dozens of experts ran it through enhancement programs, facial recognition software, and aging algorithms. Still, the man in the hoodie remained a shadow, his face partially turned, obscured by poor resolution and angle. The camera that captured him was never designed for clarity, just coverage. It had done its job, but not enough to offer a name. There were no hits in any criminal database, no missing persons files, no matches in employment records. He wasn't in the system. To law enforcement, he didn't exist. Then, a small, unexpected connection surfaced. A woman in her 20s reached out to the tip line after the photo was published in a local media piece. She said the hoodie looked familiar, specifically the logo on the chest, which was mostly unreadable in the image but had a distinctive shape. She thought she'd seen it in an old photo album her mother kept. After some digging, she found what she was looking for. It was a snapshot from the summer of 2009. Backyard barbecue, paper plates, plastic chairs, a man leaning against the fence, wearing a dark hoodie with the same logo. It was her uncle, Mark. He'd lived with her grandparents for a short time that year, at that exact house, 3 doors down from the Metcalf home. Detectives pulled up old property records. Her story checked out. Mark Benson had been listed as a resident of the house from April to August 2009. The window of Elaine's disappearance fell squarely in that timeline. At the time, Mark had no job, no registered vehicle, and no social media footprint. He'd worked odd shifts at a machine shop in another town. His background was clean. No arrests, no history of violence, no restraining orders. After moving out of Larchwood, he relocated to Wisconsin. In 2017, he died of a sudden heart attack while working construction. He was 41. No one had mentioned him during the original investigation. His name never came up in interviews. His presence had gone unnoticed, undocumented. His family had considered him quiet, introverted, even reclusive. He didn't cause trouble. He just passed through. And now, years later, his face, faded and distant in an old photo, might have been the last one Elaine saw before she disappeared. For investigators, the discovery was maddening. He was dead. There was no one to question, no way to cross-reference his DNA with the traces found in the drum, which had long since degraded. The metal had been scrubbed clean by time and temperature. No fingerprints, no forensic link, just a circumstantial match. A man who happened to be in the right place at the wrong time, or maybe the other way around. Detectives interviewed the surviving family members. None of them recalled anything strange about Mark. He didn't talk much. He didn't keep in touch often. His room in the house had been cleared shortly after he left. No journals, no maps, no clues. Just a quiet man who had walked in and out of their lives with barely a ripple. His sister said she hadn't even known he lived on Elmwood Drive until years later, when she came across a letter he'd mailed during his stay. There was nothing suspicious in it, just a birthday card. But the return address was the same house where Elaine's remains would later be found. The case remains technically open, but privately, most investigators now agree Elaine likely knew who had been watching her. The letters, the photo, the fear, none of it pointed at randomness. Someone had tracked her movements. Someone had followed her walk enough times that she started writing warnings in secret. Someone who knew her routine, her timing, and the silence of the neighborhood. Mark Benson fit that window too perfectly to ignore. And yet, without confession, without direct evidence, he couldn't be named. Only remembered. The town tried to move on. The new owners of the backyard that once held a sealed drum planted a raised garden over the filled-in trench. They didn't speak to the press. The Metcalf house was sold again, this time to a retired couple who said they didn't mind the history. Local news ran retrospectives on the case for a week. Then, attention drifted elsewhere. Another story. Another cycle. Another unsolved knot tied tight by time. Adam stayed quiet. He declined further interviews, never returned to Elmwood Drive. But according to a friend, he now kept the surveillance photo in a small frame by his bedside. Not for closure, not even for evidence, but because, in his words, it was the last time his mother was seen looking directly at the truth, not running from it, not confused, not afraid, just staring at it, facing it, as if she knew what was coming and had already accepted that no one would understand it until years too late.